these 13 colonies decide we need to form a legislative body, a continental congress for all 13 colonies, right? This is something that had been attempted before in the 1750s and even in the 1760s, but had not really garnered the support of all 13 colonies, right? Even in this political cartoon, whatever you want to call it, you can see that we have South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England, which is like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and Georgia's not there, right? So there's even in this situation in the 1770s, there are colonies that are not necessarily sure what direction they want to move in with the other colonies. But there's a Continental Congress that is set up in 1774. In the book you'll read about, there's the first Continental Congress and then the second Continental Congress. Woo! And they have continental breakfast, and it's good. The first Continental Congress is set up in 1774 to protest, among other things, taxation, unjust taxation, right? This idea of taxation, taxes being passed by Parliament in England when the colonists don't have any members of Parliament. They don't vote on any members of Parliament. And they say in 1774 that if the demands, they want, a burden from taxes or various demands. And if those demands are not met by England, then they will have a second Continental Congress in 1775, which they do. They have, because their demands aren't being met, right? And so in the second Continental Congress, that's a real tongue twister, Continental Congress, 1775, they decide to form a Continental Army. And they decide to appoint George Washington as the general of that army, because George Washington he's a Virginian, so he's a Southerner, and they thought that would create unity among northern and southern colonies. He also has military experience from the 7 Years' War, right? And the 7 Years' War, in a lot of ways, is a big reason this revolutionary period comes about, because these 13 colonies, after the 7 Years' War, they all sort of fought with each other in these militias, right? They fought this war together with England, so they feel more unified after it. And then also the taxes that they're burdened with after this war are the result of debt that England finds itself in, because of the war. So they form a continental army. Not only do they form a continental army, but all of the 13 colonies start forming militias, right? Basically citizen soldiers, right? Citizens who organize as military units. And in order to do that effectively, they start stockpiling weapons, right? Getting a bunch of weapons and putting them in like an armory or, some place where there's a collection of weapons that are secured, like rifles and stuff, probably some cannon, just in, if they ever need to use them. And that actually happens. It's in April, like spring, summer of 1775. In Massachusetts, these two towns, Lexington and Concord, the British Army, which is present in the colonies now permanently, basically, find out that there are colonists who are stockpiling weapons, who are collecting weapons and storing them in this armory. It could have just been, I'm not sure if it was like just some building where they kept weapons. They found out they were stockpiling arms. So they went to seize those arms, right? Like they're going in. These people are organizing militias. They're using that for the specific purpose of fighting us. So we're going to go take those weapons. And so when they get to these towns, they are met by a group. There's like 500 British soldiers, and they are met by about 80 colonists. And there are shots fired. Right? The fire is exchanged between both groups, and that's considered the opening stages of the military conflict that's known as the American Revolution, right? Even though a Declaration of Independence has not even been signed yet, right? And even though a lot of people still are not necessarily convinced that there's a need to separate from England, right? They're actually have an army, a continental army. They're actually organizing as a group of colonies. They're actually fighting at this point against the British Army, but it's not a 100% certainty that this is going to lead to some sort of independence movement, right? Sure. Okay. So yeah, so that's considered the first. Those are considered the first shots of the revolution, even though there's no declaration yet. So
how many died though during that?
I'm not sure. There were about 80 colonists and 500 British soldiers. I think a handful on each side. And apparently the colonists it was like a militia group. They were told by whoever was leading them, this is what apparently they were told to wait, to not fire first and wait until you're fired upon. I find that hard to believe. If there's like 80 guys who are just regular dudes with guns, and these 500 redcoat dudes are showing up, I feel like the colonists probably would shoot first, right? I mean, you'd be like, they're getting a little closer.
They should, honestly.
Yeah. And the British, you know, their experience with the colonists is from the 7 Years' War is that these guys aren't disciplined at all. They're just a bunch of regular citizens. They don't have discipline. They're not good soldiers. Like let's walk. We're gonna walk in there and just take these weapons, and then all of a sudden, like bullets start whizzing by, and you know.
I feel like they went easy on them though. How do you lose?
Well, they didn't lose. They didn't lose. That's a good point, though. It's like the numbers are. They didn't. They probably weren't expecting it. I don't think. And so, but a few people die on both sides. The first real battle is a place called Bunker Hill. It's actually not on Bunker Hill. It's on the hill that's next to Bunker Hill, but they call it. It's Bunker.
Why is that?
It's just this because of what people called it. I think they were on a different hill called like Breed's Hill, but they refer to it as Bunker Hill. So it was basically outside of Boston. The colonists were defending the city of Boston, and the British Army tries to take this hill as a strategic position so they can go occupy Boston. And they end up doing that. They end up taking this hill. Then they technically win the battle, and then they end up. I don't know why I put that in quotes. They technically win the battle, and then they occupy Boston. But they end up losing twice as many soldiers. They have twice as many casualties as the colonists do in this battle. So even though they win. There's a huge loss of life that nobody was anticipating, right? It boosts the morale of the colonists because they see, even though we lost this battle, look at the damage we inflicted, you know, against the most powerful army in Europe, basically. At the end of 1775, this guy he's the Earl of Dunmore. He's the royal governor of Virginia. He actually issues a proclamation to slaves in Virginia that if you escape from your owners and come behind British lines and fight with the British, you will gain your freedom, right? And so you end up with a situation where this is what makes the Revolutionary War somewhat complicated, right? Because you have as the sort of the figurehead of this revolution for a lot of people is George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, who writes the Declaration of Independence, right? And they're arguing for the equality of all people and freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all these things. And yet 17 of Washington's slaves, he owns hundreds of people. 17 of them actually escape and go fight with the British. They're actually remaining loyal to the British for their freedom, right? For like a freedom that's definitely more substantial, right? It's not just about taxes and being able to own land in the West. It's about actual like freedom from slavery. So in their eyes, freedom is with the British, and you end up with a situation where 20,000 slaves end up fighting with the British and British loyalists and for their freedom, right? And you have eventually the American side offers freedom. Some colonies, not all, most northern colonies offer freedom in some form to slaves for fighting, and about 5,000 slaves fight on the side of the Americans. So they're on both sides. This is arguably in many ways it's a civil war, right? There are as many loyalists as there are people who are what we call patriots or support the American side. The Iroquois Confederacy, right, which is a group of 6 Indian nations, they split apart over this Revolutionary War because about 4 of the different nations side with the British, 2 side with the Americans, right? And then you have slaves who are on both sides, right? So there's all sorts of different factors. In January of 1776, a guy named Thomas Paine, who was an immigrant. He actually had only lived here for about a year. He moved here from England. He writes a book called Common Sense. It's a pamphlet. It's like 60 pages. But Thomas Paine actually argues that separating from England is a good thing, right? It's actually that America will become a better place and a more a democratic place, right? Because England has a Bill of Rights. He argues against maintaining an allegiance and association with England because of their monarchy and their established monarchy is a king, right? How is a king chosen?
God.
Huh? God. By God, it's divine. They're divinely chosen, right? The idea is that this person, and then any kids they have, and then any kids that person has, they're going to rule over this country because that's the way God chose it to be, right? And people don't actually have a say. They're not the people they rule over are not citizens. They're subjects, right? They don't. If they're citizens, they have a voice in choosing their leaders. And so he says about monarchy that monarchy opens the door to the foolish, the wicked, the improper. Men who look upon themselves, born to reign, and others to obey, soon grow insolent. Selected from the rest of mankind, their minds are early poisoned by importance, and the world they act in differs so materially from the world at large that they have but little opportunity of knowing its true interests. And when they succeed in government, are frequently the most ignorant and unfit. I know, that's why I chose it. Sorry, I don't want to tell you guys, but yeah, that part. What is it? Because in monarchy, you end up in a situation where 7-year-olds are become king, right? Where children or people who have severe mental and disabilities. The common sense is cited as one of the big arguments, that's really well read by a lot of people. It's distributed throughout the colonies, and it's read by a lot of people. It's still very influential. And about 2 months after this thing is published, Congress asks Jefferson, March of 1776, they ask him to write a Declaration of Independence, basically to draft some sort of declaration that they can vote on, so they can decide, whether or not we want to separate from England. And he actually brings that declaration, the finished version of it, to Congress July 2nd, 1776. So July 4th is not the day. The idea that everybody was in Philadelphia in this Continental Congress, and on July 4th they all signed it, is not really what happened. It was brought to Congress July 2nd. By August 2nd, August 8th, somewhere in early August, enough people had signed it, right? We say July 4th. A lot of historians think that July 4th is the day that we celebrate because 50 years after the Revolution in 1826, Jefferson and John Adams, who is the second president, they both die on July 4th, within hours of each other. And so that was at the time in 1826, that was we'll get to it later, but there was a time of a lot of patriotism and stuff, and a lot of the early histories. A lot of the stuff that we have, the Paul Revere's Midnight Ride or the chopping down the cherry tree, a lot of this sort of mythology, national mythology history we have comes from that time period, the 1820s. So that became this sort of day, the day that's marked as the 4th of July. It's kind of like a dog's birthday, Nobody really knows when the dog was born, but you're like, let's say March 15th, sure. In this declaration, the important part of it, the thing about this Declaration of Independence borrows a lot from a guy named John Locke, who's an Enlightenment thinker, right? Who wrote, John Locke actually wrote that people are entitled to life, liberty, and property, right? Jefferson changes that somewhat to say that, what does he say? All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and those include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right?
Didn't they steal that quote too from the British?
I think actually the same thinker, the same philosopher, John Locke, used that or something similar to it in something else he wrote, but not yet. So he changes it basically. I keep trying to look for a reason, if anyone's pinpointed why he takes property out. I would imagine that even though he owns slaves, first off, the idea that people are guaranteed the right to property, right? You're guaranteed. That's not really a political equality thing. You're talking about economics, right? You're talking about resources like land. Land is property, right? Stuff, material stuff. These guys were very affluent, and there was a lot of worry that what if we guarantee everyone property, people are going to interpret that as everyone gets land.
Well, they were smart dudes. They probably knew not everybody could get.
Yeah. But if you guarantee everybody property, and if you have lots of property, and there are people that don't have any property, but you say everyone's entitled to property, what happens when they say, okay, give me some of your property then? Land redistribution. That doesn't happen in this revolution, right? This is not a communist revolution. But the pursuit of happiness is an interesting concept, right? The pursuit of happiness is does anyone have any idea what that it basically means it's like a what meritocracy is, or a merit-based system?
Yeah.
Right? That everyone, so not that everyone's, you're not entitled to success. You're not entitled to have stuff. You're entitled to earn that stuff, right? You're entitled to achieve as much as you can, if you want, whatever you want to do. The idea that you don't have to remain in the same place. If you're born into poverty, you don't have to remain in poverty. Your life is not determined by what your name is, or where you're from, who your parents are, right? That that basically everyone is allowed to recognize their full potential. that's a complicated thing too when you think about it, because the guy who wrote it owns slaves, right? He owns other people who are forced to remain slaves for their entire lives, right? So it's kind of a complicated thing. He also refers to Native Americans later on in the Declaration. He refers to them as savages because he accuses the British of having savages attack us on our frontier settlements. Jefferson's views on when it comes to Jefferson's views on like white and black people, he's very much a white supremacist. He does not believe that black people are equal. He does not believe that slaves. He doesn't believe that black and white people will ever get along. Because he thinks that, number one, that black people are inferior. He's white, that's what's called a white supremacist, right? You hear this term a lot in the news, but he was a racist. But he also knows that he recognizes that slaves are human people, and that they will never forgive white people for enslaving them. So he feels like there's this thing where he believes white people are better, but he also believes that black people will never forgive white people for slavery. So he doesn't see them ever getting along. But with Native Americans, he's got a little, it's still very, very racist, but he believes that if Native Americans eventually, if they adopt European customs as far as like property ownership and culture, and they abandon their, indigenous culture, then they're okay, they'll be citizens. He's got a this is a guy who's writing 250 years ago. So you sort of got a lot of these folks, like the founding fathers or the framers of our government, they shouldn't be revered as like these amazing people, because they're not. They're human beings.
People, yeah.
They are very fallible, right? So it's and in a lot of ways what they did in the Declaration. I mean, this Declaration of Independence is very influential. It's used by so many other countries since it was written in the last 243 years. It's been used by all sorts of different. I mean, like Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam used. But the thing about the Declaration, which is interesting, is it's not that, well, this guy owned slaves. He didn't really think the stuff he didn't really believe that all people are equal, but he does say it. He writes it down that all men. Unfortunately, he leaves out like 52% of the population. But we recognize it today as being all people are created equal. Right? This is the idea that he writes down, and people signed it, and they declare that this country is established on those principles. So even if they didn't believe it themselves, even if they own slaves, it doesn't matter. This is an idea that's put out there, and it's used a lot. And the United States as a country is held to live up to that standard, right? So, and that's why if you see a lot of books on American history or in other history classes, you'll see textbooks called like American Promise or Promises to Keep. Right, this idea that there's this promise of equality, and there are moments when the United States has come through with that promise, and there's times where they've not come through with it, where they've failed, right? Where they've taken rights away from people. You can see plenty. Slavery is a good example. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is a great. You can see a lot of different examples where this idea of equality is clearly not applied to certain groups. This is about the pursuit of happiness. Equality did not mean that everyone was in fact the same, but only that ordinary people were closer in wealth and property to those above them and felt freer than common people elsewhere in the Western world, in Europe. Right? There was less inequality in America at the time, and also the idea of people being able to sort of have mobility made a little more sense. Whereas in Europe, you have a very entrenched sort of group of wealthy people and established religious, institutions. And he also says, let me see. Oh yeah, when it comes to slavery, so a lot of people point out the hypocrisy of Jefferson being a slave owner and writing this document, or being the primary author of this document. He points out that this historian's name is Gordon Wood. It is important to realize that the revolution suddenly and effectively ended the cultural climate that had allowed slavery to exist, right, without challenge. The idea that you have, when Jefferson writes this, not only are there nearly I think 700,000 slaves in America, but 2/3 of white colonists are indentured servants. You have indentured servants, you have slaves, you have all these different people who aren't really free, or they're semi-free, and then there's free people. There's all sorts of different question marks. And when after this revolution, you have this idea of equality, you have indentured servitude that basically ends, right? That system ends, and so all you're left with really is this system of slavery, Or there's this group of people that are slaves, and they exist as slaves in the world's like first democratic nation. We're this democratic country of equality, and yet there's this. That's why they end up calling it the peculiar institution, because it becomes weird. It's like this weird, what do they call it? The 800-pound gorilla in the room. It's like, oh, this is America. Everyone seems really free here. This is nice. Who are those people over there? Like, what's going on? This is kind of strange.